We're back with the law of journalism and mass communication, getting into Chapter 6, protecting privacy and dealing with privacy laws. We're dealing with privacy laws and balancing the interests out between the press, the government, and individuals. There are 4 categories of tort law that deal with privacy and protecting individual interests. The first one that we're getting to in this video is false light. False light is intentionally or recklessly publicizing false information that a reasonable person would find highly offensive. And this is an example of false light. Take a look at this picture and the caption beneath it and see if you can figure out how this became a false light issue. You've got the headline, flip-floppers facing hard time, and then beneath the picture you have the caption, tough new dress code policy catches some CHS students off guard. School officials are handing down one-day suspensions for repeated footwear violations. All of that can be truthful, and then they've added this picture out of their morgue of photos of students that are there wearing flip-flops. The problem with this is that the caption says that students are getting one-day suspensions. Here are these students readily identifiable, and it makes it appear as if they are some of those students getting those suspensions. The journalists who put this together intentionally or recklessly publicize false information. Potentially, this can satisfy the elements for the tort of false light. Do we really know what's happened? Are these students receiving suspensions? Did they have emotional distress from being pictured? What were the consequences? To understand that, you have to know the elements of what false light are. You have to know what that checklist is. False light is making a person appear to be someone that he or she is not. The different elements. So there's the intent, intentionally or recklessly or negligently they disregarded falsity. And the key with that is the knowledge of falsity. The person publishing that information knew or should have known, in the case of dealing with a public figure or with a private individual, they negligently published false information without doing any sort of research or following the standards of care. The second element is publicizing. This is not the same publishing like you see in the elements for libel. This is pushing information out to the community or to the public generally, not just to a third person. The third element is false statements or false facts, and it could be a statement or pictures that portray a person in a way that a reasonable person would be offended. The fourth element, you have to have somebody who's identifiable and identified. So it's about an identified person. It has to be an individual, and it has to be where a large segment of the public would reasonably be able to recognize that person. And then there's the last element, which is that this false statement would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. Now, it's important to note that the person making the statement, the false statement, can be saying nice things. They could be saying that this person was a war hero, and that can still be offensive. That can still be harmful. All right, thinking back to the picture that we had with the students and the suspension story and the flip-flops, how do you think the students did? Do you think that this would qualify for a false light under these elements? That would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. So what does that mean? All right, highly offensive gets determined by the judge or the jury under the circumstances in court. So highly offensive is going to be the reasonable person standard, and that's for the judge or the jury to determine based on the facts of the case. Again, remember, it can be offensive even if the facts are positive. And what I said before, about somebody being a war hero. You've got an unauthorized biography that states that the subject of the book was a war hero, and that's a false statement. And that can negatively affect somebody even though it's a positive statement. False light cases can be placed in 3 categories: embellishment, distortion, and fictionalization. Let's take a look at each one of these. There are 3 categories for analyzing false light cases. Embellishment, that's when false material is added to true facts. Distortion, that's when the whole truth hasn't been told, or when all the facts haven't been put into place, they're omitted, or the context has been altered to make an accurate story appear false. And fictionalization, that's when some truth, such as a person's name or other identifying characteristics, are used in a fictional piece. The authors do a comparison between libel as a cause of action and false light. And in that comparison, one of the things that they focus on is that libel goes towards reputation and false light goes more towards emotional distress. So that's one of the ways you can try and distinguish the two. Keep in mind that libel has been around a lot longer as a cause of action, and it's recognized by courts. False light takes a second chair to a libel action because of the similarities between the two. There are some courts, there are some jurisdictions that say they're too close, and so they won't allow it as a second cause of action. So libel goes towards a person's reputation. False light goes towards emotional distress. With false light, different jurisdictions, they're going to have different outcomes. Supreme Court's only ruled on 2 false light cases, and in both they said that all the plaintiffs had to prove actual malice. And lower jurisdictions, some courts follow the Supreme Court's ruling, some courts don't. Courts in some states follow the Gertz ruling and allow private plaintiffs to show that negligence standard in false light cases instead of actual malice. And again, showing that you need to know which jurisdiction you are in, or if you have a choice, which jurisdiction would be the most beneficial depending on the facts and circumstance. Realize that a few states refuse to allow false light lawsuits. That does not mean that they can't bring a lawsuit for another cause of action, but it means that there are some jurisdictions that won't allow false light as a tort that can be sued under in that jurisdiction. It's important to know what jurisdiction you're in and know how they interpret the law and what the laws of that jurisdiction are. The last thing that I want to bring to your attention with false light are the defenses, and there are a number of defenses similar to libel. So, we talked about absolute privilege. That's where someone cannot be sued for the statements that they make. That goes toward government officials acting in their official capacity. Conditional privilege, that goes towards the press, and that's where you have a journalist relying upon statements from a government official. Truth, that's another defense that can be used, just like with libel. But substantiality, it doesn't have to be where this is a perfect statement. So substantiality, or something that's substantially true, that is good enough. Opinion, just like with libel, opinion, because there are no facts, then it can't be where there's something that's false in there. Statute of limitations, again, that goes back to what we talked about with libel. Snooze, you lose. In many jurisdictions, the statute of limitation is 1 year for false light. In other jurisdictions, it can be longer. And be aware that there are some courts which, instead of using the specific statute of limitations for false light, they will use a general tort timeline and allow for a longer time period than 1 year. Anti-SLAPP legislation, in order to prevent frivolous lawsuits, sometimes those can be applied, again, based on the jurisdiction. That is the basics of the tort of false light.